Sorry, what's the problem now?
It's okay, Chair.
Okay. So it's Mark Thomas, and then...
Yes, thank you, Chair. If I could, just to give a response, I can see that Bob Fenwick has got his hand up as well. So I'm sure that Bob can comment. He's probably want to come in about the grass verges on highways, right? So I imagine that Bob will. So I'm not going to preempt anything Bob wants to say on that. Two things I wanted to comment on, really. There may be a number of specifics that have been discussed and will be discussed during the meeting today pertinent to this year. And it's just a little reminder that, if we've got particular incidents this year, we are still not back to normal levels yet in our many of our regimes. And if you look at sort of weed treatment, we may have been having more complaints in than normal, and that's because for 3 or 4 months there was no weed treatment, and then since it started up, we've had, I think August was pretty much a washout, and as we all know, once it's raining, heavy periods of rain and that, they can't spray, etc., etc. So I'm just mindful that we don't use the appearance we've got this year as a typical appearance, because it's far from typical. But I just wanted to respond, and Councillor Sherwood touched on a couple of things about we don't have to just react and just because we've got public support to do something. That's quite true. And I wasn't trying. I think the key for us is when I'm sitting here and when we talk about part of my portfolio, this all comes under my portfolio. Some of it under parks and some of it under highways. So if we look at the park side of it, parks cut the grass that they are asked and told to by the council to cut. So the issue isn't a parks issue, it's a council issue. And Councillor Sherwood reminded me when she talked about policies. And this really is a policy issue rather than, because if the council told the parks, we want you to leave the parks uncut or half cut, or part of it cut, or that bit cut, and that bit not cut, that's what parks will do. So it needs to be directed really to the council and all of us, rather than perhaps just parks. And not that anybody was having a go at it, suggesting that for a minute, but as resolving the wishes of the Scrutiny Committee in making a decision about if we cut parks and what parts of parks we cut, it's a decision beyond the management of parks, and that's the point I'm trying to get. And when it comes to highways, it's similar, but not exactly the same. As I touched on earlier on, there are some parts of highways that we have a statutory obligation to undertake, vision splays, as I alluded to. There may well be parts, as Councillor Fitzgerald said, that are not necessarily on the highway, but further apart, that are non-statutory, but we cut them because we always have them. And again, highways, I'm sure, and I'm not going to steal any of Bob's thunder, will, if there's an instruction that went out that said, you don't cut this and you don't cut that and you don't cut that because that's what the council wants, then I'm sure that that's something that highways would pick up. But I just wanted to make the point that it's not a highways decision and it's not a park decision, because of there's widespread public interest in all of these things. And I think Councillor Fitzgerald did, she's quite right what she said. There are people who desperately want these verges to grow for biodiversity, and there's definitely a lot of people who want them neat and looking tidy. Now, it may be that we end up telling people what they're going to have, but in an ideal world, you want to bring people along with you. So, it's about education, and Councillor Jones touched on the point about people don't always necessarily understand the implications of everything we do. And maybe there's an opportunity here to start, explaining to people that you can't just stop weed spraying. So you're happy not to use spray, but there needs to be an alternative weed management program in, because I think most people would find weeds totally uncared for or untreated or unmanaged. Most people would find that unacceptable if we just never touch them again, I'm talking about. So, and it's finding that what is right. Do you leave them during the summer months, during the pollinating months, and then treat them, etc., etc. But that's all I wanted to say is that these are big decisions, council decisions, and probably and possibly policy decisions that go beyond the remit of myself and or parks or highways. Thank you. Sorry, Chair, I'm rabbiting on.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's a very important point that you're making there, that we're talking now about a key area of policy. And this is something that I'm sure this panel will want to express a view about when we respond on conclusion of this meeting. Before I come to you, Bob, I see that Linda is now unmuted. So please, Linda, do tell us what you want to say.
I really just want to say something about, I would like to see a proper policy about cycling and walking, because I have had everybody congratulating us about the flowers and the fact that they're being let to, be natural. I haven't had that problem, but during lockdown, I can't walk the dog or answer the phone or anything without people complaining about the cyclists and the walking. I mean, I know that, we're all encouraging cyclists and we think it's a good idea, but please don't forget about the walkers, because the people will not walk along the prom anymore in front of where I live, in front of King George playing field, because they find it too dangerous, because the cyclists don't ring a bell, they go too fast. When I was in North Wales at a conference, they seem to have a really good policy there about signs saying share and care, and I know that it's a problem to have a divided area where there are cyclists and walkers, but just want to say, please, can we look at that and have a policy about that? That's all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Linda. I mean, I'm a walker myself and go frequently along the promenade. Much of it, of course, there is a demarcation line to separate walkers from cyclists, which in my experience is mostly observed. But as you get closer to Oystermouth, it seems not to be observed because it becomes more crowded. So thank you, that's a very important point. I've also seen Christine Richard wanting to speak. So sorry, Bob, we'll get to you eventually. Christine.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to pick up really for starters on what Linda's just said, that's something that I was going to mention. Yes, we praised the fact that many more people are using their, are cycling, but there are some very badly behaved cyclists out there. I've witnessed, for example, on the main road in my own ward, going up Castle Street, cyclists just whipping up on the pavement without a care of pedestrians. And the same thing going through the park and the other parts of the cycle lanes. And I think one of the main issues is coming up at speed behind people, lots of people, older, perhaps, less mobile people without warning, and children running around in a park, of course,
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it is an issue. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was about wildflowers and weeds. But then Councillor Mark Thomas came in and sort of covered what I was going to say. It would be, I think, a good move to try and win over hearts and minds about leaving wildflowers, weeds, whatever you want to call them, because I think for a start, there is far more land within City and County of Swansea that is not owned by the council, but is owned by the residents of Swansea. And if you can, get this message across about leaving patches of garden or green space or what have you, something that we would do together. I see what Mary's saying about saying you're going to have it and that's it. But I think there's far more to be gained from winning hearts and minds and trying to bring people along with us. And I think I know the wide verges that Wendy was talking about. I think I lived very close to one of them, and it's quite a huge swathe of grass. And so that's all. There are also very practical reasons sometimes for not cutting the grass. This summer, during a very dry spell, I specifically asked parks not to cut the grass at the back of Lacher Castle, because when they did cut it and there was all this lovely dry clippings hanging around, youngsters set it on fire. Yeah. Okay. So sometimes it's just a very practical issue as well. That's all, Chair. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that, Christine. Yes, I mean, I certainly garden for wildlife, and I'd like to encourage more people. We need to find a way of encouraging people across Swansea to garden for wildlife, both in terms of habitat creation,
same here,
benefit, and the birds. Bob, Bob, you've been waiting. Did you want to come in on this discussion? Bob Fenwick.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Very quickly, sort of two themes, I suppose. The first in relation to highways verges and cutting and wildflowers, etc. Obviously, parks do all our management of verges. The only thing we would ask them to do is to cut where there is a danger, sight line, or it's needed to be kept short for drainage. Where a verge is used for the purpose it was intended, which is a highway purpose of passing on it. Those are the only times that we would get involved. Anything else is fair game as far as we're concerned. We don't expect anything other than safety and statutory use, I suppose, or where the complaints are coming about use. That's in relation to verges. Anything else you want to do with them, it's down to parks and yourselves. And just echoing the Councillor Mark Thomas there. On weed spraying, the second point, weed spraying, the only spray we've lost this year in terms of highways, what we spray are the hard surfaces, so the joint between the road and the curb, the back of the pavement. We don't touch any weed spraying near verges. We don't spray those. We've lost one small spray this year, which was the main route into town, Fabian Way and Oystermouth Road. That normally gets a fourth spray as an additional. That was cut. Everything else is a little behind, but it's all been done to standard. So really, the weeds on the Mumbles Road are down to the one missing spray. Everything else, weeds-wise, is down to weather and the fact that we've got a fairly minimalistic spraying situation anyway. But it is there, it is updated. We finished the second spray and the third spray should be starting shortly. I think that's it, really. Hand removal on the prom as well. We normally do, the only area we can do hand removal on is those priority areas, which would be basically Oystermouth Road. We normally do that once a year if it's needed. We just haven't got the resources to do it. Otherwise, 1,500 kilometres of footway, we just don't have the staff. So that's the comment. Nice and sweet, hopefully, nice and short.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob, and particularly on glyphosate use, weed spraying, obviously. I think this is something we will want to look at separately from today's meeting. I'm reassured from what you say about the limited use. But I still think it needs to be examined more carefully because obviously, particularly from the United States, there has been serious issues in terms of human health and obviously impact on wildlife as well, impact on bees, for example, allegedly from the use of glyphosate. So this is something we clearly need to explore a little further. Does anybody else want to come in on this particular issue? In terms, Will Thomas. Well,
yeah. Sorry, Chair. Yeah, just one other point. Mark spoke about the need to have a weed management sort of system in place, and recognising not all areas, well, probably the large majority of areas don't have community councils, but obviously some do. Those community councils in some places have got budget and the will to sort of address this problem. I mean, for example, Mumbles Community Council, which I'm also a member of, we've employed last year a natural environment officer, who's been looking into exactly this. So I'm wondering, Mark, if there might be an opportunity to liaise with the community councils, just to see, how this could play out in reality, and we could even. The budget from community councils might be a way of addressing some of these, some different methods into trying to see if we can address this problem, and just see by experiment which ones are better, really. Just seeing what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, if I may, Chair. Engagement with community councils and or others. I mean, if you look at the council's approach to the community and the community engagement, Friends of Parks, for example. So they look after and do many of the tasks that we are no longer able to do. So, if, for example, Mumbles Community Council wanted to take over weed management in Mumbles or sections of Mumbles, then that is definitely something that we would be interested in having those discussions. Where it gets tricky for us is the method we use for I'm not stealing Bob's thunder now, for weed management is a fast spray of an area. So, a contract company comes in and will spray the whole of Mumbles. To leave out one or two narrow lanes or streets is difficult to manage. Now, if it was a case of we don't spray a whole section of mangles or an whole zone of mangles, then that's relatively easy for us to do. So all we do is take it out of our spraying program, and then it doesn't have to be, you know, either Mangles Community Council or a group. I mean, a typical example would be an estate. If you had an estate in anywhere, Penclow, Mumbles, Pentlegare, where the residents said, we don't want spraying anymore, and we are going to manage that as a friends of type group, then that's something certainly we'd be very interested in taking on board. And then that friends group who've got a, you know, and because it would be labour intensive to hoe and manage weeds in the traditional manner. But that is any sort of groups or organisations that are willing to take on this, please feed that through, and we definitely will engage with them, because it helps to reduce the use and dependency on glyphosate. As Bob said, the issue we've got is we cannot put the labour in instead of using. We've looked at alternative methods, but we simply don't have that labour resource. So if the communities are willing to do and contribute, we are more than willing to listen and engage with them.
Yes, thank you, Mark. Before we move off COVID, and I'm conscious of the time, we've had nearly 1 hour now of this meeting. Councillor Bridget Rowlands, who isn't able to be present this morning, wanted to raise the issue of fly tipping, which she says has been increasing during lockdown, particularly in rural areas like Mower. I'm wondering, is there any comment that anyone wants to make in relation to fly tipping during COVID? No? Okay.
Did you want me to respond to that, Chair? I mean,
yeah,
I'm happy to respond, and Chris, I will as well, if Chris is still on the line. I'm sure Chris can come in. Look, it is something we are conscious of. It is something we are tackling, and I think we're doing a very good job of it. But it is difficult, particularly in areas like Mower, and Councillor Rowlands has raised this previously, and she understands the difficulty for us as an authority is that we are charged with clearing fly tipping off our land. Now, when you go to the more rural wards where there's common land and private land, and I know people don't like to hear us saying it, but it's not our responsibility to clear fly tip materials of non-council owned land. And yet, as soon as somebody sees fly tipping anywhere of any type, the expectation out there with the public is that the council should clean it up. And that's where it leaves challenges for us. Now, we do some clearance of private land or non-council owned land where it's deemed, you know, absolutely necessary to do it. But that's where it leaves us with a challenge. We never have cleared all fly tipping in all areas of Swansea, because it's simply not our responsibility. But I do understand that the public don't necessarily want to hear that, because they see, quite rightly, the fly tipping is a blot on the landscape, a blot on their communities. And who do they turn to in those situations to do that? And that's the council. But we haven't got the resources to do it all. But I know that we have done a very good job of tackling under these difficult circumstances. As I said, I don't know if Chris wanted to make a contribution. Chris, I will to it, but
I've got Linda Tyler-Lloyd showing. So before we go to Chris, Linda, what did you want to say?
I just wanted to say thank you, because someone had put a grill outside my house, which is a what you call it, unadopted lane, and I just contacted Environmental Health, and by the time I went out at 10:30 the next morning, it had gone. So please, thank you for that anyway.
Thank you. Chris, final point before we move on to the next item.
Indicated,
Yes,
Chair,
Chair.
but you can't see me.
Sorry?
I've waved and I have indicated my hand.
Come in, Mary.
Yeah. It's not to do with fly tipping, it's actually to do with cycling, and it's a really good question. On the foreshore, especially around Brimmill, you know, where the pedestrian crossing is to go across to the wreck, there's an incline on both sides, and cyclists come down there at a terrific speed, and we've witnessed it quite a lot lately. Is there any way we can put any kind of speed limit? Because these bikes are going extremely fast, and I don't know if there's such a thing as a speed limit for a bike. Perhaps somebody can enlighten me.
Well, I think there are speed limits for bikes, but they're usually more ignored than adhered to.
Yeah, and I'm not 100% sure of where we are legally or legislative with me. Can I get a written response for that, Chair, if you don't mind? I'll contact us because I don't want to speculate over it. I don't think that we can do speed limits, but I'm not 100% sure. I'll give a written response to Councillor Jones when I get it.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you very much, Mark. And
Peter, can I just raise, before we, I accept that you can't see the hands up. I just want to raise one issue about verges and grass cuttings. I visited a couple of towns recently, Shrewsbury, Telford, and also Street with business, and their entrances look absolutely pristine and shows that they are proud of their cities and proud of their towns. I have to say, Fabian Way is a mess, and it looks a mess, and it doesn't show that we are proud of the city in Swansea. I know Mark mentioned it earlier, and it has been mentioned. There is a balance, absolutely 100%. But I think what we have to show is you are welcome to a city which is proud of itself, proud of its inheritance, and proud of what we are doing. At the moment, that doesn't seem to be the case. It might be my view, it might not be the view of others, but that's where biodiversity in areas is a balance to have. But our entrances must show what we are and what we are for.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure that point is well taken, Steve. Chris Howell, finally, before we move on to the next item, did you want to add anything to any of this?
Yes, please, Chair. Both fly tipping and the verges, really. Maybe if I take the verges first. The last point made, obviously well made, it clearly shows the difference of opinion. Fabian Way is one of our wider verges, and some people want it cut and some people want it left. So what would be really useful would be a steer from the council as to what the council wants. But in terms of the effect of COVID, you also need to remember that, like this year, we didn't start cutting until May, any verges. But that's not something we could do every year because it was so dry in April and May, so nothing was growing. So it's been very unusual in that respect. From a personal point of view, I'd like to see us cut a lot less. But we need a policy and a direction which is suitable for Swansea, which would be totally different to somebody like Monmouth. Monmouth is a very rural authority. People like Ceredigion and Denbigh are very rural authorities. So we would need to have, in my view, places like Fabian Way and our narrow verges between footways and roads cut down. We'd need to cut metre strips either side of narrow footways to make sure there's no encroachment. But apart from that, I'd certainly be open to any different form of management. And we need to understand that leaving vegetation grow is not, we're not managing it. It still needs to be managed, but it's a different way. And if we are going to cut, so you can't leave something just grow and not cut it at all, that would just turn into kind of brushland. So what Plant Life recommend is a twice a year cut, and ideally removing those cuttings. We currently use about 15 ride-on mowers. They're not capable of doing that type of work. So if there's a policy, the timing of it needs to be such that we can invest in different equipment to cut long grass and equipment to collect it if that's what's required. So, absolutely open for that, but it needs a change in policy direction and an understanding of the change of equipment required and the timing and investment needed for that. And in terms of wildflowers, yes, we have introduced wildflower seeding, but I think there is an alternative strategy as well around more natural wildflower growth, which need a totally different type of growing medium, and then won't need the preparation that the sort of cultivated wildflowers need. In terms of herbicide, in parks, the areas that we spray, we've cut down by about 75%. So that was all pre-COVID. So we spray a lot less. And it means that there's less aesthetics in some people's view around lamp columns and trees and safety barriers. But my view is I'd rather see long grass in those areas rather than be sprayed where it's not needed for safety. Fly tipping very quickly. Obviously, through COVID, we had to stop our bulky waste collections from people. All our recycling centres were shut down, so there was nowhere for any material to go. But now all the services are reopened. The only thing we don't do at the moment on recycling centres is take black bags, but we do take all bulky non-recyclable items. People can bring furniture to us. They can bring fridge freezers to us. So really, there is no excuse for fly tipping. And I would echo Mark's comments that it's something we need to manage as best we can. And also, it's understanding where the council's responsibility starts and stops, really, with regards to fly tipping. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I think the clear message emerging from this discussion is the need for a new policy think in terms of how we manage as a council grassed areas, road verges and the rest. And I think we will need to explore that directly with cabinet members and others in terms of how we can develop a clear policy guidance and the process that will need to be involved in arriving at that policy, particularly in terms of wider public consultation and how we do that and so forth. I think there is a clear message that's very helpful and also other issues that have been discussed during this discussion, Ray, COVID, which of course will impact on the next item on our agenda, which of course the impact report of the Scrutiny inquiry into how the council manages for natural environment and biodiversity. And of course, this was an inquiry which I chaired throughout 2018, in particular reporting early in 2019. And obviously, again, because of COVID, there have been delays in actually following through in terms of delivery. You have papers, you have a copy of the original report, you have a copy of the initial cabinet response to that report, and in Appendix C, you have an update report on each of the 20 recommendations, actions taken or to be taken, and so forth. There's a question of how we manage this particular item. We've covered a lot of ground already in terms of issues that are covered on further in the inquiry report. Now, one approach would be to go quickly recommendation by recommendation, but as I say, there are 20. The alternative approach would be simply to invite comments and questions on the report. What I would like to do, well, first of all, to recognise that Councillors Paxton Hood-Williams, Yvonne Jardine and Jeff Jones, who were members of the inquiry panel, but not now of this particular panel, they are present and obviously invited to participate in this discussion if they so wish. Deb Hill, who played a prominent part in the development of the inquiry, is unfortunately unable to be present today, but we do have, of course, Paul Mellor. And I'd actually like to invite Paul, first of all, if I may, to make some comments, and then I'll invite David Hopkins to come in, and then I'll open it up to questions and comments. Paul, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just to say, Deb now has been able to join us, so she is here to answer questions later on.
I hadn't noticed, thank you.
Okay, so thank you for sort of summarising the background to the report, and the report sort of focuses on what has changed since the original inquiry, to what extent the agreed recommendations have been implemented, and the impact. So sort of briefly running through sort of the headlines in terms of what has changed. We've had the council's first Section 6 biodiversity monitoring report submitted to Welsh Government, setting out the key biodiversity actions and initiatives the council has undertaken, and we're preparing a Section 6 plan now for the next 2-3 years. The sort of biodiversity duty actions listed under the corporate objective for maintaining and enhancing Swansea's natural resources and biodiversity have been expanded to take on and incorporate the recommendations from the inquiry. The quarterly and annual monitoring reports now set out steps and actions that are being taken to meet the objective, and there are also a number of performance indicators that have been adopted as part of the council's business planning. The corporate biodiversity working group has been set up, which is monitoring progress and the steps being taken. Last year, the council's notice of motion declaring a climate emergency has sort of led to work on a climate emergency action plan, and that work is also falls under the remit of the corporate biodiversity working group. This panel today has obviously been set up as a consequence. We've produced a draft Swansea Central Area Green Infrastructure Strategy, and we've carried out consultation on that, which is due to be reported back before the end of the year. All service plans now have to demonstrate how the relevant service areas contribute to meeting the council's biodiversity objective. And biodiversity clauses are included in service level agreements and licenses and leases, etc. In terms of the actions or recommendations rather being implemented, I think it's worth, the report largely summarises work undertaken over the period 1920. It sort of anticipated work that would be implemented this year, but I think one of the effects of COVID has been the delay of certain grants and the appointment of project officers, which would have been able to take some of the identified recommendations forward. So, in terms of the recommendations, I think at least half of them have been implemented fully. But I think it's important to emphasise that they're not they were never task and finish recommendations, or very few of them were. And they will remain an ongoing commitment for us that form part of our work programme. So certainly some have been almost fully implemented as anticipated by the panel, but some are just still in its early stages in terms of perhaps training, etc., which understandably hasn't been able to be rolled out as we anticipated. There's probably three of the recommendations, which are the ward and maps of biodiversity and green infrastructure assets that we haven't had a project officer in place to take forward. Linked to that is the work with schools and the school governing body, environmental link governor, and also the employment of a dedicated outdoor liaison officer. So they're the sort of key areas that obviously we're still optimistic, but we will get the grant funding to be able to employ the officers to take that work forward. And then in terms of the impact of the inquiry itself, I think it's helped focus on what some of the quick wins. There's additional actions that were planned as a result of the inquiry include the sort of that embedding biodiversity duties across the council, and I think there's been heightened awareness there, and that's certainly been very welcomed by those who work within the natural environment section. I think it's that increased profile has it certainly assisted in terms of collaborative working both within across service areas and with external stakeholders. There's greater opportunity now for costs to be shared across services. We've renewed license agreement with the South East Wales Biodiversity Record Centre. And wherever possible, we try to provide that biodiversity and natural environment advice in-house, whereas perhaps previously it would have been outsourced. We've also managed on a temporary basis to employ a part-time planning ecologist by sort of reallocating tasks between officers, moving monies around between grants, if you like. And that person's also currently filling in as the local nature partnership officer until we have an appointment in place. So if you want me to run through the actions in more detail through questions, I think that might be perhaps the best way forward, Councillor Chair.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Deb, I see that you've joined us. Is there anything you wanted to add to Paul's comments? You don't have to.
No, I think Paul's covered it. Happy to answer questions, perhaps if there are any specific queries.
Okay, thank you very much. And David Hopkins, David, from your point of view.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's always good to talk about the national environment, the biodiversity, and I think it's something that's certainly on the on our scope as a cabinet. It's something that was never talked about many years ago, and it's really great to see the difference that has been made. And I think the policy group that's taking place and this document is a game changer. But as Paul said, it's not something that's going to happen overnight. This is a working document that will be embedded through the council. I know COVID has got in the way, particularly sort of lots of training. But when you look at the city centre redevelopment, it's nice to see the green infrastructure policy that's in place. And actually developers are actually embracing that. And I think I never ever envisaged, I thought we'd have to be insisting people would want to do these things. But no, they want to do them. They want to contribute to the environment. And it's really encouraging. And I think we as a city are really proud of what's going on. And I think, very importantly, biodiversity is everybody's problem. It's same as safeguarding in this thing. I think safeguarding is a huge issue throughout the authority, and it's been embedded that everybody got that responsibility. And my ambition is that everybody would have the same thing on biodiversity within the authority. So training has unfortunately been delayed, but as soon as COVID will enable us to, then obviously I'm sure we will get on with that. That's it really. Just to say that I know COVID has delayed some of these. I can assure you, particularly the grant funding, we will be chasing it up. We will be looking to see what we can do to get this grant funding. Ideally, we need it over a longer period of time, rather than bidding for it constantly. It would be nice if it was more of a planned 5-year programme going forward. But we can work with Welsh Government and lobby ministers to see what we can do with that. But happy to sit and take any questions. But sorry, before I finish, I would like to thank Paul particularly and Deb for the way that they've pushed this topic forward. So, and yourself, Peter, it's been inspirational on times. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those comments, David. And I would like to reiterate your comments both in relation to Paul and in relation to Deb. Much of the inquiry report wouldn't have been possible without their involvement and support. And I think just making a general comment as the person who initiated and chaired that inquiry, I think it's been very successful in terms of its impact on the council, the way we think, the way we work and the way we prioritise. I think it has brought the natural world up the agenda, and that's incredibly important as we face up to the challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss. Having said all that, I had intended to go through the report recommendation by recommendation, but there isn't time to do that. I will just quickly open it. Are there any comments or questions that anyone wants to raise on any of the recommendations in the report? I've got a couple I shall make at the end, but are there any points that others want to make first of all? I can't see everybody, incidentally, so please shout.
Yeah, Chair, I have got my hand up and I had.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. Yeah.
Yeah, can I just, it's very, very brief comment. Something that David said, that developers are embracing the environment. Well, that is a positive, but I don't think it's entirely true from the experiences in my ward where we lost an enormous landmark tree and an area of ancient woodland, which is irreplaceable. So I'm slightly cynical there. With regard to the recommendations, etc., I think there's so much in it that is really, really positive. recommendation 19 makes reference to schools and what schools can do. It mentions making the most of school grounds, guidance booklets, etc. And I'm sorry to link back to our previous discussion. I did have my hand up, but you didn't see it, obviously.
Apologies.
Yeah. What I do think we perhaps need to put a focus on at some point, throughout COVID, wherever there have been gatherings of young people, regrettably, there's been a lot of litter. And there's no doubt that litter is very damaging to the environment. It looks unsightly. It can produce all kinds of unpleasant effects. I'm just wondering, Chair, if there is any opportunity in the future for us to look at how we get embedded into children's minds that dropping your rubbish is unacceptable in terms of the environment.
Absolutely.
I really think this is something that's critical. You know, we can't surely go on seeing the consequences of gatherings when you end up ankle deep in rubbish. You know, we go along our verges and people are just throwing things out of the car windows. So is there any scope at any point in looking how we start embedding in children that dropping rubbish anywhere is completely unacceptable and cannot be done by anyone and should not be done? It's something I feel passionately about because I was at a school where a headmaster was fanatical about rubbish. One milk bottle top was sufficient to have the school gated at lunchtime. So I go around with pockets and bags full of rubbish, as do school friends. So, you know, it is a plea. Can we think about what we can do to deal with this continual problem?
Well, thank you, Wendy. I agree entirely with your sentiments. I don't know the answer either, but clearly this is something that we can seek to address, and we'll include it in our comments to Cabinet members for further consideration. Linda,
could I just say, Peter?
Oh, yes, sorry, David, go ahead.
On that particular note, I know we used to, I don't know whether we're still doing it, but I thought our enforcement team used to go around schools many years ago. I don't know whether we still do that, educating and talking to children. I don't. Chris Howells is still on the call. I don't know whether he can answer. Do we do anything with education at the moment, Chris?
Chris?
Yes, we do educate, and we're looking to put a new contract for a contractor who will provide additional litter enforcement, and part of that contract would include then also doing promotional activities such as visits to schools. Unfortunately, a lot of the problems, as Wendy suggested, is it's not the young children, often it's the older children, and sometimes even who are then going to McDonald's, jumping in their cars, eating McDonald's in the car, and then out the window it goes. So they're a very difficult to reach group because I guess they have their priorities in life that they're interested in, and unfortunately for a lot of them, environment isn't on top of their priorities. But it is a perennial problem which, you know, I'd welcome any suggestions to tackle. We've currently got an anti-litter campaign running at the moment, and also Keep Wales Tidy are also about to start a national anti-litter campaign across all of Wales.
Okay, thank you for that, Chris.
Yeah.
It's a tricky issue. I don't think any of us necessarily knows the answer at the moment. And I think this is something that we will need to pursue on another place and another time. Are there any other further comments?
Yeah, I just...
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Linda.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that I entirely agree with Wendy. I am passionate about this as well. in my school, we had to put our chairs on the desk and we used to have to pick up the litter because the teacher used to say, Mrs. Robinson, who is the cleaner, is not here to clean up after you. I was always baffled by this because I used to think, well, what is she here for? But yes, I mean, I was brought up to be take your litter home. And I really do feel that we should plug that more in the council and nationally in Wales. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I just don't understand littering. I really don't.
No.
I just understand the mentality behind it. Okay, there are a couple of points I wanted to make on the.
Sorry, Peter. I think there's a number of us who've got hands up at the moment. That's myself, Steve, Jeff, and Christine. I just wanted to come in, if I may, for 2 minutes.
Okay, go ahead, Paxton.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to say thank you for the invitation to come to this meeting and be part of it and listen to what's going on, because obviously it's been very interesting and informative at this stage. As far as the recommendations are concerned in this, then obviously you're making progress in a lot of areas on those. The two I'm going to concentrate on at the moment are really numbers 7 and 17. And I guess that's because of my background in terms of community councils and the fact that there are organisations out there which do an awful lot of work. Christine, for example, will know about Christine, the other Christine down in Pontarddulais with Coibach, for example, and there's a lot of work goes on down there, but there's a lot of expertise within those groups as well. Apart from the fact that those groups could benefit from contact with people like Debbie in the council and that sort of thing. Obviously, I think there's a lot of experience and knowledge out there as well, which the council could benefit as well. So the more that we can encourage that sort of two-way communication, I think it's got to be positive, and it's certainly a way forward that we could certainly look to do, and is part and parcel of ensuring that we are working with the general public and got to get the general public behind us. I think that's probably what I wanted to say at this point, Peter.
Thank you very much, Paxton. Absolutely, one of the key thinking emerging from the report was public engagement, the voluntary groups, and so on. Jeff, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yeah, I agreed with a lot of the comments people have actually made. And yes, you know, before this group was actually set up, I think it certainly raised the profile of green issues. But as David Hopkins has actually said, this is not going to be a quick win. A bit disappointed with regards to the resource that's going to support this. I know Deb's team and Paul's team have actually been undermanned for quite a time, and I think you've actually identified that. I think it's been more of a beg, steal and borrow and so on. But really, at the end of the day, with all these I just want to question really the commitment of the council to actually carry this forward. What really worries me at the end of the day, we talk about all these green issues and then we build 16,000 new houses on green land. I don't know, I just question really the policy of actually building all the time and taking green spaces. I know we've built on green areas already. I won't go on to the Singleton problem and so on, but I think we really need to, if we're actually showing commitment, we need to really look at our building policy and only build on brown areas. Why are we still continuing to build on huge swathe of green areas? That's all I want to say.
Thank you for that, Jeff, and it's certainly a sentiment that I suspect many of us would share, but it's again a big issue that I don't think we can address at this particular moment. Christine, you also wanted to come in, I understand.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was just about litter and dumping and Wendy's comments really about youngsters. I think we've already somebody actually said that it wasn't the younger element that seemed to be the problem with drop-in litter, that it was older people and indeed adults. I think the worst culprits that I've seen for drop-in litter and what have you are indeed adults. Just speaking from personal experience down here by Lucker Bridge and on the foreshore, over lockdown, it's been apparent that people cannot be bothered to take their litter home with them. They pile litter bins high. There was even a huge sack of household rubbish. I think it's like a 4-ton sand sack or something, dumped in the river, which was going up and down for a while, and then just landed on the bank. So I think, yes, very important to teach this and instill this in our schools. But my personal experience is the biggest culprits are indeed adults who should know better. Yes, thank you for that, Christine. Clearly, environmental responsibility is a major message that needs to get out. I'm sure it does get out, but unfortunately, there's always a minority who choose to ignore it for whatever reasons. Before I invite David to come back on this overall, there are a couple of points I wanted to make. He won't be surprised. Recommendation 12 concerning the appointment of a Section 6 biodiversity officer. I mean, I've had various discussions with Rob Stewart and others, and also it was included, as I understand it, in the budget. Funding for this post included in the budget for the 2021 financial year. So I'd like an update, please, David, from just what is happening about filling this particular post, which is so important to reinforce Deb's team in terms of meeting our responsibilities under Section 6 of the Government's Environment Act. And the other point I wanted to make, well, there's also recommendation 13, of course, involving the appointment of a full-time planning ecologist. We only have this temporary post at the present time. There's also the question of the corporate working group. Good that it's been established, but I'm really slightly concerned about what it's doing and where it's reporting and just quite what is going on. So I'd welcome some comments there, please. I mean, one route might be for the corporate working group to report, I don't know, every 6 months or every 12 months at worst to this particular panel, so that we can keep abreast of what it's doing. It clearly has a fundamental role to play in terms of ensuring that the natural environment and biodiversity are up the agenda in terms of all the services across the council. But I'm not clear quite what has been going on. So welcome comments on that, please. So those two posts and the corporate working group. David, please. Thank you.
Yeah, on the corporate working group, could I just say I tend to agree. We do need a feedback on that. There's no doubt. COVID have obviously delayed matters because obviously people have been concentrating on elsewhere. So I'll get an update on that, and obviously I think it would be a good idea for it to report back here. As to the Section 6 officer, as I say, it's been delayed via COVID. My intention is to set a meeting up with myself, Deb, and Phil Holmes on his return from holidays to look at this of where we go, particularly with the ecologists as well. So it is on the to-do list. We've obviously been delayed by COVID, and I will certainly liaise with yourself once I got further update on that, Peter, as soon as I can. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Am I correct, incidentally, that there was funding provision made in the budget?
Yes, for the Section 6 officers certainly was there, and we were looking at grant funding, I believe, for the ecologist post as well. So there are lots of things happening behind the scenes. I will try to get an update on you as soon as we can and report back to you. Okay.
Grateful, Dave. Thank you very much. I'd certainly like to be involved, please, in those discussions when they go ahead with you and Deb and the rest.
I shall, no problem.
Thank you. We need to move on now to item 8, which is the local flood risk management.
Chair, could I, sorry to interrupt. It's just really calling on for some clarity really from the panel in terms of its conclusions and the outcome of the discussion that you just had with regard specifically to the monitoring of the inquiry recommendations, or whether you're happy to sort of, accept progress that's been made and draw a line under those, or whether you feel that there's a need for a further formal follow-up, etc.
Well, thank you, Chris. I should have, thanks for reminding me. Well, it's only my view, and welcome comments, but my view is that we don't need to keep on reviewing the entire inquiry report process and recommendations, but there obviously are issues within those recommendations that will require follow-up. And I think the way to do that is on an individual basis relevant to those recommendations. And I think unless anybody disagrees, I think that's the way the panel can take it forward. Does anybody take a different view to that? I'll
No.
take silence, I hope, as an answer. So yes, we will want to address some issues, but we will identify them as necessary as the process moves on. Thanks, Rich. Thanks for that. I'm very conscious with local flood risk management. When we had our pre-meeting last Friday, a lot of issues came up in the discussion. Consequently, I think we need to give some time to this. Now, I'm not quite sure who wants to introduce it. Mark or Bob, who wants to speak first?
Yeah, perhaps I'll just introduce it. Bob and Mike Sweeney are on the call. They'll go through the detail of it, Chair, because as you're aware, it's very much a hot topic today, and looking into the future, I think it's continue to be a major topic for discussion. The only thing I would say, in sort of leading up to them presenting, detail on where we are and progress being made, etc., is, again, it's a bit like very similar in relation to public expectation regarding flooding is not dissimilar to public expectation on fly tipping. And whenever a flooding incident occurs, everybody sees and expects and turns to the council for resolution of that. Very often you'll discover, after we look into things, that not all incidents of flooding, in fact, most of them are not due or down to the responsibility of the council. However, I'm very conscious of the fact that we are the go-to people whenever somebody is in distress and somebody's house gets flooded. It's one of the worst things you can probably encounter. And I do understand that public perception is to call on the council in times of need. But there is an expectation that the council will fix or can fix any issue regarding the flooding, and very often they are on private watercourses, non-council responsibility areas, etc., etc. And it's often leaves people disappointed when the council go back and say, look, that's not our area of responsibility. But we do help in many areas where we can, and we try and be as responsible as we can. But I'm sure Bob and Mike will be able to give you some more detail on the incidents. I mean, this year has been quite exceptional, as well as the COVID. The number of flooding incidents we've had, there is definitely something going on with the weather and climate change or whatever, because as we all can witness now, it doesn't rain anymore. We just get torrents. Ordinary rain doesn't appear. It just comes down in mad bursts, and our infrastructure isn't designed for many of these flood incidents. But I don't want to steal Bob and Mike's thunder, so I'm happy to hand over to them, Chair.
Yes, thank you, Mark. And I'll invite Bob in a second, but just to reinforce the point that I think you've already hinted at there, and that is, of course, climate change and the impact of climate change on the increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite first Bob and then Mike to comment, bearing in mind, maybe to comment also on our preparedness or getting ourselves prepared for likely more severe weather events as we go forward. Bob first.
Okay, I'm only going to speak quickly on this because Mike's got most of the details.
All right.
It's just to set what you said about global warming and the changes of rainfall. We've got staff working for us in highways that have been dealing with drainage and flooding and these sort of things for something like 35 years. Now, we've had 3 different occasions in the last 12 months where these people have said they've never seen anything like it. These are the guys that are in the watercourse up to their necks trying to sort people out, and they're saying that the situation has changed massively. We've got to listen to them. It's a very, very difficult area. Having been involved in being on call on one of the storm surges, it's probably the most traumatic experience I've had in working for the council. I've been here for quite a long time. Very difficult to deal with. We do feel that there's an awful lot of pressure put on us by those that aren't necessarily understanding that we're trying to help, but not everything is our responsibility. We've got some major work to do to get that message out there in terms of expectations and managing that we've got different levels of responsibility for highways, and then as a local lead flood authority, that the issues are different. On one hand, it's very limited to our assets, and on the other hand, it's trying to help people. that's my main point. I'll let Mike go into the details. He's got a little summary that he should be able to go through.
Okay, Mike Sweeney, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. If I just follow on from Bob's comments, and I got a bit of an overview really of the storm events that have taken place over the last 9 months, and just to highlight the extent of the rainfall events we've actually experienced. It's been quite a demanding 9 months in terms of flood risk management. We've had 3 significant storm events which have caused devastating impacts, not to residents, and also I think it's placed a high service demand on the highway department. If we look at the storm events and the areas of Swansea which were particularly affected, if we go back to the autumn storms, we just had a series of autumn storms where we just had Atlantic fronts coming in on a frequent basis. And in particular, 2nd November, we had major flooding up in Birch Grove and Kilsamlet areas. About 20 properties were affected by flooding. There's also widespread flooding on the highway infrastructure where roads became impassable. And most of the flooding was a result of fluvial flooding, that is, overspilling watercourses onto the urban environment below grids and watercourse structures. So that is the first significant event which we experienced. And following on from that then, in February 20, there was a nice storm that came away called Storm Dennis, which caused real significant impacts to a widespread flooding right across Swansea. Effectively, I think if we look at the nature and scale of the event, I think there were 89 flood warnings issued, 61 flood alerts, and that was more warnings at any one time in Wales. It was an unprecedented event, if you like, the amount of warnings we had. Effectively, 1 month's average rainfall in February was experienced in 1 day. So the actual volume of rain caused significant impacts to the residents of Swansea, and obviously delivery of our response to that demand. You look at the fire service attending properties, I think it was 65 properties attended where floodwaters are pumped out from residential and businesses. And we're looking at the worst affected areas. I think it's been well documented, and you've seen it on social media about areas in Gorsainan, Clydach, Gowerton, and in Penllygare where you had multiple residence properties affected. I think in total, from that storm event in February, there were about 75 properties which had internal flooding. And to meet that demand and to go out and visit communities and investigate issues has really put a strain on the service delivery. And then following on from that, and just to recap on the last storm event in June, this was a totally different storm, a storm which created by localized thunderstorms and very difficult to predict. And unfortunately for the Swansea Bay area, which includes Calais, Coch, Sketty and West Cross areas, we had roads turning into rivers, and effectively a multitude of flooding incidents, which was again caused devastating impacts to the residents of that area. So, when you look at the 3 storm events, you effectively to have 100 properties affected by internal flooding is something I've never experienced before. Working for Swansea Council, I've been here for 30 years, and something which certainly took demands on the service area. So I just want to put that forward really, just to illustrate the extent of flooding which we have experienced. It's obviously sort of linked to climate change, and if these patterns of rainfall events are to repeat themselves, then obviously we need to be prepared for that, or for them incidents going forward. So that's what I want to do really, is to give an overview of the flooding, and hopefully for you to get an appreciation of that scale and demand on the council to respond.
Yes, thank you very much, Mike. I mean, certainly it's my view and the view of many others that the frequency and the severity of these incidents is going to become worse as the years go on. Climate change is rolling forward and governments aren't doing enough about it, but that's another story, of course. Jeff Jones, I know you wanted to come in on behalf of Mary, well, Mary was going to speak originally, but if you could come in and say something about what happened in Calais.
Yes. Thanks very much for that. And yes, you know, I sympathise with Mike Sweeney. His workload must have quadrupled, really. And I think it actually comes down again, you know, we need to look at the resource in these sections. You know, climate change is certainly changing, and we can't ignore it at the end of the day. We do need to take action. I think we need to look at some of the policies we've actually got in place as well. I know one of the things that's actually come out with, and I'm not saying this was a total consequence of its drains not being cleared. I know drains, except for a few of them in Swansea, are only cleared once every 36 months. And I know, speaking to some residents, I know they've not even been cleared, you know, every 36 months. So we need to look at that and so on. And I know Mark Thomas actually said as well that, you know, public expectation, you know, the same as fly tipping and so on. Well, I agree up to a particular point, but again, coming back to, we can't ignore, you know, the public's fears at the end of the day. I think flood water is an entirely different subject to fly tipping. I know people are fearful, really, especially people perhaps that are disabled, of water coming into the house and not being able to get out of the house and so on at the end of the day. And again, I know Mike actually mentioned about, you know, the last instance we had in Calais, but it's not a one-off. It's an ongoing problem. I think we need to look at, okay, there may be one-off causes because of, you know, change in the climate, but there are also other areas where it's, shall we say, a regular occurrence. And I think we need to take action and so on. This is where well, I don't know if it's going to be the Westminster government or the Welsh government at the end of the day, but I think we need to really pursue some of these areas that have, shall we say, regular occurrences. It's not only businesses and houses that are actually disrupted, it's also, you know, the main thoroughfares as well. It causes chaos and so on. And again, Mike has actually mentioned, you know, the fire service. I think in Calais, I think we had about 7 fire tenders from various areas as the water, and thank God they actually, you know, did turn up, or there would have been a lot more damage. So I think, you know, this is an extremely important area. As the climate worsens, and it is going to worsen by the look of things, we need to really change our plans. Okay, thanks, Chair.
No, thank you, Jeff. I mean, I think you've just reinforced the seriousness of the problem that we as a council and others are going to face. You know, I worked on climate change for more than 15 years prior to becoming a councillor, and during that time I just saw the negligence and the failure of governments to act in response to the advice coming out of the IPCC and the science community generally. Here we are now facing possibly risk of runaway global warming. I hope that isn't going to be the case, but we're getting perilously close to that kind of outcome. Coming back to the locality, Wendy, you've got a couple of points I think you wanted to make to us. Wendy, you need to unmute.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Yes, yeah, I do agree with what Jeff has been saying. I mean, to be flooded is a terrible thing to happen to you, and it causes an enormous amount of distress. What I think we need to do is to have some kind of strategy in place in recognition that there are certain areas where flooding can occur in the event of extremely heavy rainfall. Now, if you are by a river, it follows that that could cause a problem. If you are near some other kind of watercourse, such as a culvert, that too could cause a problem. And I do think for the benefit of our residents, we need to have some clear understanding of what caused the flooding experience that have taken place in Swansea, and how the council is going to monitor things to try to ensure that in the event of another similar rainfall occurrence, that flooding is going to occur again. In my ward, for example, 8 properties were flooded, council-owned properties. I'm still not clear as to exactly why this occurred. Now, Was it that an underground culvert was blocked? Did that, put pressure on the water table? Did that mean that the water was trying to get into the drainage system, which then couldn't cope? I'm still waiting for clarity around this. I know this is not an easy thing to determine, but I'm sure others are looking for similar answers to the problems in their area. Clearly, we must have something in place to reassure residents that action is being taken, say in the autumn of the year, to deal with the drains. We clear the drains, we clear the gully in areas where there is a flooding potential. That gives residents some kind of reassurance. Just recently, Pontus Road in my ward has been flooded. So again, was that due to a blocked gully? What caused that problem? It's an elevated location. One wouldn't imagine under normal circumstances that it would be flooded. So I think we need to have some kind of strategy in place to help us manage the flooding situation, which is, as has already been remarked, likely to be more common in the future. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Wendy. I'll ask Mike in a moment perhaps to come back on those questions, but beforehand, I know that both Irene Mann and Mary Sherwood wanted to come in on this issue of gullies, drains and so forth.
And me.
Irene, would you like to say something about this, Irene Mann? Irene? Oh dear.
Can I say something?
Mary, go ahead.
Go on, Mary. I was muted. Sorry.
Go ahead, Mary.
Well, okay. Look, I'll try. I'll try. I know. Well, I do understand Irene's concern, and interestingly, it's something that I did discuss with Chris Howells some time ago. And to be honest, I can't remember what Chris said about it. So, I know that Irene is concerned that when gully clearance is arranged for a neighbourhood, sometimes people aren't aware and local councillors haven't been informed, and so we're not in a position to help make sure that they are kept clear of parked cars, and then there's some wasted journeys. So I think that's what Irene in particular wanted to raise today, is whether it could be better coordinated so that councillors can help with communications and make sure that those visits are not wasted, because as Jeff has already raised, they happen infrequently and they're badly needed. My concern is more about the question of preventative maintenance, and the fact that I know because of austerity and cutbacks, I'm concerned that maintenance schedules of the past are no longer adhered to, and things like road sweeping. So my understanding, again from old conversations with officers, is that we see the gullies getting blocked by leaves, but actually what's going on underneath, which is more significant, is the silt. And that when streets were being swept regularly, leaves and silt and deteriorated road surface material was cleared and didn't have the chance to wash down and block the gullies. But since there's been cutbacks on road sweeping, I understand that there's been more of a problem with gully blocking, and I want to ask the officers if that's correct, and whether they feel that the council is perhaps spending more on reactive emergency responses to flooding than being able to invest in ongoing sort of maintenance which might prevent the gullies blocking. And I do understand all the budgetary constraints, and what I'm interested in is some discussion about whether more funding into preventative work and a return to more frequent road sweeping might be seen as a preventative measure for gully blocking and ensuing flooding. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Irene, did you want to come in on this discussion at this point?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
No, I have a concern with preventative measures, but my whole sympathy is with the highway and cleansing teams. It's so very difficult to cleanse curbside when you've got constant car parking. We have, working with your officers, we've done leaflet drops to houses and asked people to move their cars so that we can access the gullies, clean the curbside, and I agree with Mary, it's silt and leaves as well that cause these problems. So that overarching view of telling or requesting residents to move their cars so that the curbs could be cleaned of silt. But the problem is with cleansing, they can't access those all important gutters, and that results in the buildup of silt and leaves. So it's trying to bring more collaboration between the incredibly hard-pressed highways. I believe there are only 2 gully cleaning teams for the whole of Swansea. And when you hear of Bob saying how many kilometres of roadway we've got, I think we do very well in what we do. And again, all praise to the officers involved. But I think there needs an overarching collaboration between cleansing and between highways. If we can clear streets, and can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And if we could clear the streets of the cars, then we have more of an opportunity to get the gully crews down at the same point. And we've done it. I've done it in Eton. I haven't done it. The boys have done it. Eton Crescent, St Helens Avenue, to both long streets, and King Edward's Road, because the other problem we've got is cement mix put down and sand when developers are developing properties. So the highways and cleansing work against everything. I think they do wonders. But if we look at more collaboration and working with cleansing crews, I know they've got some new kit they might want to purchase once it's been tested. But I do think we have potentially an opportunity to get cleansing and highways potentially in a more collaborative way. But that's also not discounting the huge input that residents can have. If residents actually listen when we do the letter drops, move their cars, so that we have access. You can't blame either cleansing or highway. Half the time they can't get to the gullies. But that would be my view. More collaborative work, and if Mark is still there, more resourcing for them. Highways are incredibly high, huge pressure on them. And it's not until you've seen them try, as Bob made the point, up to their waist in water and everything. They do a wonderful job. But I do think they deserve to be more highly resourced and certainly a more collaborative approach between highways and cleansing. Is that okay?
Thank you. Thank you, Irene. And I would just add, you do a wonderful job as well. I see you out regularly collecting litter from all sorts of parts. So right, to come back on this discussion.
I want to.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Chair.
May I speak? I think I've got words to say.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Linda.
Yeah. I just want to say, while we've got Mike here, please, it would be remiss of me if I didn't say black pill, because I'm still banned from the post office because I haven't dealt with the problems of flooding in Blackpill. So please, when you're talking, I agree with everything anybody has said before, but please don't forget Blackpill. That's all. That's all.
Chair, could I just come in very briefly?
Oh, sorry, Will. Yes.
Yeah, is that okay? I'd just like to very briefly just share an experience, because obviously Newton, my ward's quite elevated, so I've only this year had any experience with flooding. And as Mark pointed out earlier, it's not always the council's responsibility, but I mean, the 2 officers that have been involved with helping out in this situation have been exceptional. Nigel Fitzgerald, must be in the surname, Wendy, I suppose, and Chris Pike. They've been very helpful at putting the residents, making them feel like something was being done about their issues and trying to sort them out. And they've been liaising with Welsh Water and keeping the residents up to date and informed. So I think they've done a really good job with that, and I'd like to pass on my thanks to them there. I do think just the one thing I'd feed in is when someone gets flooded, obviously as everyone's pointed out, it's a hugely stressful time for people. And I just think I'm not sure if we provide any sort of pack of what to do next, what's my situation, and because a lot of the time it's just they just don't know what to do, who to report it to, where to go, who to speak to. So maybe there's something the council can do there with a list of contacts and what's my situation. I'm not sure if we do that. I'd just like to ask that really. Okay, thanks, Will. I noticed incidentally that Deb has in the chat list put up a reference to the SUDS legislation and that this would start to address the problem of flooding in relation to new build. Of course, doesn't address the issue of existing build, but just to note that. Right, Mike, please do come back on this discussion, and maybe Bob, if you wish to.
Yeah, I think Bob's going to. Mike, can I cut in first? Is that all right?
Yeah, whether. Yeah.
Just quickly, just to split it into two areas. Obviously, what Mike deals with generally, he helps us out with drainage, and they do some of the larger schemes. Mike's responsibility is the local lead flood authority, so it's investigation into flooding, looking at what's happening, and then feeding back to Welsh Government to try and get grants and additional funding to try and solve the big problems like Black Pill. And he's got a list of those, and we can deal with those. Outside of his remit is the highway drainage side. Comments have been made about coordination with cleansing. I'm not sure Chris is still here, but we do work very closely with our cleansing colleagues. We've got for instance, a pre-storm sweeping route. So those areas that have flooded regularly, Hill Lass, places like that, that have really suffered, and there is perception of suffering, and there is real 6-7 feet deep in water. So we get all those streets swept for us by cleansing whenever we ask them for it, and that is done on a regular basis now. So we do try to work together. The issues of coordination with councillors and streets, it can be done. It's very difficult. It's very time consuming and resource consuming. What you got to remember is a gully team might hit 20 streets in a day, every day. So to try and organise each one of those streets in terms of movement of cars, it's just not feasible. We did try it. We can do it as working with Irene in Uplands, particular streets where we've really hit a street. That can be done, but it has to be on an ad hoc basis. But that doesn't mean to say we don't try to work with cleansing colleagues all the time. Resources, there's news, obviously we had extra resources this year, and we've purchased an extra gully machine which takes us up to 4. Now we've managed to fill the posts for that during COVID, so we've done all the interviews and everything else during lockdown. Everything's been done distant, via video, etc. But the posts are just about in now, so that will give us an extra vehicle. Comments were made about cleaning drains once every 3 years. That is the standard that was adopted some years ago at the start of the asset management process. But what we have got, and this is being followed by Wales as an example of sort of good practice, is that we've reviewed each of our gullies individually, and each gully has been given a category of every 6 months, every year, every 3 months. Now, this is obviously being refined, but what we would rather do is those gullies that are less important, we will clean once every 3 years. And if some of them don't even need cleaning, I mean, there's a gully outside my house that's been blocked for 10 years, and I've told them to leave it. It's on a hill, it doesn't do anything. I would much rather have them their time spent doing the more important issues and the more important areas. Sometimes, though, from a highways perspective, we have to remember that what we are there for is to drain the road. Our surface water drainage is all about the road. Now, where there are bigger problems and more flooding, and the road takes the brunt of it, but properties are flooded too, sometimes that's why we have to pass things off to Mike's team, because the drains in the road simply aren't enough to drain that level of intensity of rainfall. We do have frequently asked questions for people online. For those people that are subject to flooding, there's some good web pages out there, and we've got some good detail online for that. So in answer to all Thomas's comments, if people are scared and they don't know what to do, there's some excellent advice online within our pages. I say we've had an additional vehicle this year, and also we've been given an assistance fund for the first time, whereas highways, we should turn more people down, and we should say we're not doing this. But obviously when houses are flooded, and you've got somebody with internal flooding, we've always tried to help. We've got a little bit of fun now that will allow us to do that. And there was an example of a flooding, internal property flooding in just outside Pontleu recently, where we were able to deliver sandbags. We'd normally have to have said no. So that's a positive. That's going forward, and we are certainly trying to look at that. Last point, there's an All Wales Asset Management Group and a project where all councils in terms of highways and those similar services are working together to look at things that could be improved. And there is work going on at the moment in relation to drain cleaning, how we do it, how we look at best practice. The initial recommendations, we already meet about 80% of the recommendations of what they do. I think we're very good at that. We changed processes some years ago under Chris Howells to a system where when we visit the drain, we make sure it's clean. So when others might clean the drain quickly and move on, but actually the pipes are blocked. Or if you look at the drain and it looks like it's working, but actually it's the tail end of the drain that's broken, we stay there till it's fixed. So that made a big difference under Chris, and we felt that's had a massive improvement for us. So I think we're actually quite proud of what we do in terms of the drainage. That doesn't help obviously when somebody's property's flooded or there's a major flood outside your house. So we don't always sort of sing our praises about these things that we think we're doing well, because it can be very offensive to people if they've suffered flooding and they've suffered detriment. But we do try to help. Right, I'll pass over to Mike now, because he's got the land drainage side of things, and he can give you some feedback on some of the bigger issues we're looking at, what we're feeding back, feedback there.
Yeah, just if I could just refer back to Councillor Fitzgerald's point about the follow-on flood investigations. As part of our responsibility as lead local flood authority, we're duty bound to undertake flood investigations. What that involves, obviously, we've had a high number of flood investigations to do this year, and obviously COVID had restricted the use of contractors to camera survey, CCTV, culverts and the like to understand their condition. But going forward, we're trying to get around most of if not all of the flooding areas or communities with CCTV works, and just as an appraisal of what we've done, I think we've done about 10 kilometres of asset survey data since last year. So effectively, where we've had flooding incidents, we've actually carried out camera surveys of the culverts. So linear length has been about 10 kilometres done. So that's good. It gives us an understanding if it's a quick fixes to problems, whether or not there's root infestation in the lines, or whether or not there's structural deterioration of culverts which need repair. So that's part of our work. So, but as lead local authority, we've got to understand the flood risk in communities. We've had numerous flooding in communities at the moment, and we've got to get to the stage where we understand that flood risk, and that information has got to be shared back to you as members and plus local communities. For instance, in the Lower Gorsainon area and Clydach, where we duty bound, if there's more than 5 properties flooded, we duty bound to produce Section 19 flood investigation reports, and these are to be published on the website. And this will indicate the understanding of the flooding, the cause of it, and sort of work out the performance levels of the drainage system serving that area. So, it is good work being done, but all this costs money. And in terms of what we are utilising at the moment, it's all supported by Welsh Government revenue grant. My fear is, though, going forward, we've spent a lot of that allocation at the moment. So as you go through the autumn and winter months, and if we get a series of other flooding events, then I think we should be looking at how we can fund further investigations as we go forward, because we are very much reliant on Welsh Government funding. So that is a concern and something we need to recognise.
Thank you, Mike. That's a very worrying but very honest recognition of the scale of the problem that we're going to be facing. I mean, flood is going to be a rising problem, I suspect, in coming years for reasons that we've already addressed to do with climate change. And there is therefore going to be an issue of resource to enable you and your colleagues to deal successfully with it. And I think that will be a message back from this panel to Cabinet. I'm conscious of the time. It's now 20 to 1. We've already overrun, but I'm also conscious we've got one final urgent issue that I know Councillor Christine Richards wishes to raise with us, and this relates to the train derailment at Llangenach. and consequent environmental ecological impact. Christine, are you able to join us and say something on that?
Yes, sorry, I had my camera turned off because internet isn't at its best down here this morning.
See you now.
Yeah, okay. Right, I think last Wednesday night when the train derailed up at Llangennech, we woke up on Thursday morning to overwhelming smell of diesel, which had clearly come from the train. It was a 25 wagon train travelling from Milford to Reading, carrying, well, I think it was 75.5 tons of diesel in each carriage. There are 25 wagons, 5 of which were derailed and 4 of which were on fire, and you could actually see the explosions quite clearly from down here. My neighbour took photographs and all the rest of it. Since then, I mean, clearly the important thing was to mitigate loss of life. People in Llangennech were evacuated from their homes, and I spent a lot of Thursday looking at the detail, and thank you to Mark who sent links through to was it National Resources Wales updates, and of course there are the rail company updates as well, to let us know what's been going on. I went through Thursday with a whole what if, because to me, I mean, the fact that the driver and the 2 people on board have presence of mind to decouple many of or most of the carriages, I think, well, has probably meant that it wasn't as bad as it could have been. The fact that it happened just outside the village of Llangennech, again, meant that it wasn't as bad as it could have been. And when you consider that this train was travelling from Milford to Reading, it could have been in a far more densely populated area along that route. So thank goodness that that it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Having said that, clearly diesel has got into the estuary. It's a site of special scientific interest. There's been work done. I know that they've cut trenches to intercept the diesel. They've been vacuuming and skimming and monitoring local courses, and they've put booms and absorbent pads in to try and soak up the diesel. There have also been sort of aerial surveys, and they've picked out diesel down as far as Crofty, I think, Mark. That's what they were reporting last week. I think my concern is, and I know that as a council we're involved in this, but what I really want to know is how did this happen? And I know that there is an inquiry and there will be a report. And how are we going to prevent anything like this happening again? These trains, these massive cargo trains that travel from Milford to Reading, London, whatever, carrying all kinds of oil products, diesel, I think aircraft fuel, and they carry all kinds of things. And we've got to be absolutely sure that they're safe. We've taken the hit, if you like, this time. And we're dealing with, cleaning up, and there's a lot of, mitigation going on. But I think the important things is for the future is knowing how this happened and what is.
I'm on a Teams meeting and we had to answer it because bring me later.
Microphone. Yeah, I've said my piece. There we are.
No, thank you very much.
That's it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's been an extremely helpful and detailed account. I mean, I've not been able to keep up with it, so I'm not up to speed. Mark, do you want to add anything to what Christina said? Mark Thomas?
No, not really. I think Christine has covered it as best. I suppose the difficulty we've got as an authority now is that obviously we are involved and directly with Tom. He's our link. Yeah. But, you know, there are Public Health Wales, Natural Resources Wales. At the beginning of the outset of this incident, it was being controlled totally, the site, by British Transport Police, before any of those other agencies had come on board. So we are definitely involved in it and are getting information, but we are not at the lead of this. And certainly with the investigation, I think what Councillor Richard said is very important here, is that everybody along the whole length of these tracks will want to have an avid interest in what preventative measures, because it's frightening to think that it could have been a lot worse. And if it wasn't for the foresight of the people on the train to do that decoupling, I dread to think of the and yes, it could have happened in far more sensitive areas. I don't mean environmentally, closer to communities, and there could have been a substantial loss of life. But I would imagine we're probably several months away from having the outcome of that, because it'll be an intensive investigation, and we're involved now, obviously, in the, because there's an unknown. The cockle beds were closed immediately, but we don't know the impact that's going to be having. That is a triple SI site, as we all know, but that's an industry that people and families and communities rely on. Close to my heart, obviously, being in Penclough, and to think that you don't know that, when are these cockle beds going to be allowed to be reopened, So testing is going on as we speak, but there is a fear factor, and I'm sure amongst the gatherers, about when will they be able to resume their employment and their livelihoods, So there's more unanswered questions, unfortunately, at this stage, and we've got answers too. But all resources that can be deployed are being deployed, and we'll know as soon as we can, really. And it's, as I said, I think everybody beyond Swansea, beyond Carmarthen, will want to have reassurances as well about the future transportation of these, diesel fuels and aviation fuels, etc.
Thank you very much, Mark. Clearly, it's a very serious issue. Obviously, as a panel, we'd be particularly concerned about the impact on birds and other wildlife, including the cockle fields that have been mentioned. And we'll have to wait to see what the inquiry report tells us and what lessons can be learned and taken forward into the future. But thank you, Christine, in particular, for bringing this to the attention of the panel at short notice. Clearly, it was a matter that we ought to bring ourselves up to speed with and consider for the future. Right, well, that brings us to item 9, which is simply letters between myself and Cabinet members. Has anybody got any thoughts on those? Otherwise, I'm hoping you don't, to be perfectly honest. I'm conscious now 10 to 1. We've overrun by about 20 minutes or so. I think we'll leave on one side, Bridge, the issue of issues for future meetings. We can discuss those separately away from the meeting. So I'd like to draw the meeting to a conclusion and simply thank everyone for your participation. I think it's been very informative, very comprehensive, and proves the value of having this panel, I think, in terms of the work of the council. So thank you very much, everybody, and bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
Yeah.